Welcome, bienvenue. I want to welcome all of you to our second last 2021 CIPMM Webinar Wednesday program. My name is Carolyn Montague. I'm the president of the Canadian Institute for Procurement and Material Management. Today, we have a fantastic presentation by our three presenters on the path forward on federal Indigenous procurement. We have Ian Zuto, Senior Advisor, Acquired Services and Asset Sector at Treasury Board of Canada. Michelle Cousineau, Manager of Indigenous Procurement Policy Division, Strategic Policy Sector, Acquisition Program, PSPC, and Daryl Gumini, Senior Policy and Program Officer, Business Development, Indigenous Services Canada. I think this is going to be a great presentation, and I want to welcome all of you to it. We can get underway. This is our second last webinar, and next week, our last webinar is going to be on software procurement. So please let everyone you know about it. I think it's going to be another good session. And for, I think, a lot of us, this is the kind of topic that helps us sort of get a sense of what's coming up, what's going forward. Next slide. Of course, I would be remiss not to remind you all to register for our CIPMM Virtual Summit. I think we're up around 400 delegates at this point. It's going to be a lot of fun, great topics, and of course, we have to throw a few wrinkles in, so we've got some networking rooms that are going to be fun, and we have a magician and a puzzle for you to do, and a game while you're there. So 2 days of great topics, all around the theme of managing complexity. Next slide. And a little heads up, I've been trying to say this in all of our last few webinars. As you all are aware, CIPMM has an award series that we do, that we give out at our national workshop. Well, we've added a special award this year, and it's really tied to recognizing people who've gone beyond the call of duty in terms of COVID. And this one, we don't think we're probably going to restrict it to a single recipient. So I'd love for you all to go and nominate someone, nominate a team. We will be looking at those in July, and we'll be making decisions in August and let the winners, of course, know. But we also have our traditional awards, which recognize innovative practices, recognize good teamwork, good projects. So please go and look at our website at the different award categories and nominate somebody. And finally, something's coming up. September 28th and 29th, our national workshop returns. We had to miss last year, and I think everybody really missed it. This one is, I think, going to be as good as ever. It's going to be virtual. But what's really interesting is it's a 2-day national workshop. They're going to have up to, I think, 10 different master classes that are part and parcel of your registration. So I think that, and those will be in October and November. So I think that it's going to be a great opportunity for everyone. So let's get underway. So I'm going to turn it over to Ian, and we'll bring his deck, his and Michelle and Daryl's deck up. But again, thank you, fellows, and Michelle, for joining us today. Path forward on federal Indigenous procurement. We're going to talk about the Nunavut Directive, 5% mandate commitment that I believe there is an MC about, and of course the PSAP program. I will defer to the rest of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Carolyn. Wanted to say I'm very happy to be part of this. I'm very happy to be sharing this stage with my colleagues, Michelle and Daryl. When we were approached to do this presentation, it was mostly focused on the Nunavut Directive, but we felt that providing this overview of Indigenous procurement landscape in the federal government would be very useful and very timely. And so we're going to be talking, more broadly about some of the policy instruments that are currently being used within the federal government, how things are evolving, and we'll focus on a couple of the policies, so Nunavut in particular, but also to share, some of the things that are coming down the pipe. And it would be a possible segue for us in the future to focus on specific items that we're talking about today. And so if you want to flip to slide 2. Yeah, so just a bit of background on the Indigenous policies that are currently that are currently being used right now. My colleague Daryl from ISSA is going to be talking mostly about Indigenous procurement modernization, some of the evolving context there. I'll jump in and talk a little bit about the Nunavut Directive, some of the measures that you might find very, very useful in your work. And we'll have Michelle wrap it up with the 5% mandate commitment and talk about some of the next steps coming up. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Daryl to lead us into Indigenous procurement modernization.
Next slide, please. So this slide demonstrates the growth in Indigenous working age population, education levels, entrepreneurship, businesses, and their contribution to the Canadian economy. According to the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, their business survey, there are over 50,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis business owners in Canada. This is a self-identified survey, and I believe there's a large segment of those 50,000 businesses that have maybe one employee at the most. So they're small, maybe medium-sized businesses in general. For those of you not familiar with the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, or the CCAB, their mission, they're an Indigenous firm whose mandate is to foster sustainable business relations between First Nation, Inuit, and Métis and Canadian businesses. Of course, they do work with the federal government, and I guess what you're seeing here on this slide is an example of some of that work. Also, according to the CCAB, in 2016, Indigenous businesses contributed an estimated $12 billion to Canada's GDP, and the total combined income of Indigenous households, businesses, and governments reached $32 billion. A report by the National Indigenous Economic Development Board states that national reconciliation is not possible if Indigenous peoples continue to be excluded from sharing in Canada's prosperity. For those of you not familiar with the board, it's made up of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis businesses and community leaders from all regions of Canada. And they estimate that Canada's GDP would grow by 1.5% or $27.7 billion per year if barriers preventing Indigenous Canadians from participating in the economy were removed. Next slide, please. So procurement is a powerful catalyst to stimulate Indigenous economic growth. The Federal Indigenous Procurement Strategy, launched as the Procurement Strategy for Aboriginal Business, or PSAB, has been instrumental in encouraging Indigenous businesses. Excuse me for not unplugging my phone, apologize for that. So PSAB is a national policy, meaning that Indigenous businesses have the opportunity to compete for local, as well as other federal government tenders throughout Canada. Language can be included in the request for proposals to encourage using local suppliers and/or employees. We noted that modern treaties take precedent over federal policy. However, the definition of modern treaty businesses is respected in the claim area if PSAB is applied. We'll talk a bit more about the Indigenous Business Directory. It is the source for qualified Indigenous firms looking to do business with the Government of Canada. Of course, that is for PSAB. The Inuit has the Inuit Firm Registry. So maybe talk about that in a little bit later, but it is the self-declared Indigenous Business Directory for ISK. So I'll just maybe touch on a bit of ISK's role as well to help other federal departments provide evidence of Indigenous business capacity, providing advice and guidance on implementing Indigenous procurement policy, educating procurement specialists on the benefits of using PSAB, working with 100 procurement specialists across the Government of Canada, also educating on procurement policy. So basically, those who are in PSAB, I'm actually doing this presentation on behalf of them. Outreach is a part of their job. So if you were with the federal department and you want more inclusive presentation that can be arranged. So outreach is what they do. Next slide, please. So procurement obligations under modern treaties. So modern treaties are CLCAs, comprehensive land claim agreements, are constitutionally protected agreements. Of the 24 modern treaties in effect, 22 have economic measures procurement obligations, including the new federal directive in Nunavut, the Nunavut directive. So some of the tools that are their existence are set aside. So PSAB restricts or conditionally restricts certain contracts or portion of a contract exclusively for competition among qualified Indigenous businesses where capacity exists. So you have a mandatory set aside, which is used for procurements that are destined for an area, community, or group in which Indigenous people make up at least 80% of the population, and where Indigenous population will be the recipient of the good or service, or for example, construction. Voluntary set aside may be employed if Indigenous capacity exists and operational requirements, such as best value prudence, sound contracting management can be assured. Conditional set aside, when it's impossible to determine Indigenous business capacity, a conditional set aside can be used. This means that procurement is open to Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses. However, if two or more Indigenous businesses submit a bid, then the procurement is set aside under PSAB. General clauses for these can be found in the supply manual. So Indigenous participation or benefit plans are a portion of the value of a contract that's set aside for Indigenous participation, which may include subcontracting, employment, training, skills development with flexibility for grants, scholarships, and bursaries under PSAB. To count towards PSAB departmental objectives, Indigenous subcontractors must meet PSAB eligibility criteria. And there's also open contracts won by Indigenous firms. So Indigenous businesses winning contracts open to all suppliers. This counts towards PSAB departmental objectives. So Indigenous firms must meet eligibility required criteria as well. And regular contracts refers to a procurement that has not been set aside for Indigenous businesses, such as open tenders, where a self-declared Indigenous business wins the contract. Next slide. Over to you, Ian.
Back to me. Thanks very much. So before we get into the Nunavut directive, I wanted to repeat something that Daryl had mentioned. Really, I want to punctuate the procurement obligations within modern treaty areas or CLCA areas, that these are legal obligations. And so you have to meet these obligations first before applying some of the TBS policies. I think that's really important, and you can reach out to our colleagues at PSPC or ISK to also help understand what those obligations are. So before getting into some of the measures of the directive, I just want to provide some history for a bit of context. So the Nunavut Land Claim Agreement was signed in 1993 with the predecessor of the Nunavut Tungavut Incorporated Organization, or NTI. We'll be using the NTI acronym quite a bit. They're the designated Inuit organization, or DIO, representing the Inuit of Nunavut. There were lawsuits against Canada related to alleged breaches of Article 24 of the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement, including failure to provide sufficient procurement policy guidance in the Nunavut settlement area. In 2015, there was a settlement agreement which required Canada to adopt a Nunavut-specific procurement policy in close consultation with the NTI. In 2018, there was further invoking of dispute resolution, and in 2019, with support from PSPC, Suriname, ISK, and Justice, consensus was reached with NTI, and the Nunavut directive finally came into effect December 20th, 2019. I mention this because it's not just another TBS administrative policy. This Nunavut directive is steeped in meaning. It's a legal obligation that we have, and so we take this very seriously. Okay, so that context aside, so how does this apply to you, and who does it apply to? So this is slide 6 in front. The directive applies to all departments and agencies in Schedule 1.1 and 2 of the Financial Administration Act, with the exception of the CRA. Directive applies to any government of Canada contract where deliverables or a portion of the deliverables are delivered or performed within the Nunavut settlement area. Again, this is something to highlight. Supports and advice is available on how to construct those procurements. The directive applies above any other TV policy, and where there's conflicts of a legal obligation, the legal obligations will apply. So the outcomes are there. It's to provide Inuit of Nunavut with means to participate in economic opportunities, improve capacity of Inuit firms over time, increase contribution to employment of Inuit at a representative level of the Nunavut workforce. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the slide that outlines some of the key measures, things that you should be aware of. So first and foremost, there's considerable emphasis on active forward planning. And so departments are asked to submit annual procurement plans in the NSA to ISK, Indigenous Service Canada, to allow for early support and engagement. So this provides our colleagues over at ISK to reach out to assist with any sort of market research, to help with understanding what the procurement is, to support, where it can be parsed out, and we'll talk about that in a second. We highly recommend consulting with our colleagues at ISK and also PSPC on procurement specifics, strategies, because there's a lot of mandatory measures that are in place based on the specifics of your procurement. So for example, checking the IFR to determine that there is Inuit firm capacity before soliciting and or inviting for bidding. And also something to mention, the directive also applies to real property leases in the Nunavut settlement area. There's changes on how you set up your procurement approach, like I mentioned. So it's looking at ways to unbundle your procurement to permit smaller and more specialized firms to bid. There's requirements to limit bids under certain conditions where capacity exists. So for example, you must limit when there's 2 or more firms on the Inuit firm registry for procurements 25,000 and above, or for leases 100,000 and over. Solicitations need to include socioeconomic bid criteria, again, under certain conditions related to Inuit benefits and Nunavut benefits. So Inuit benefits entail Inuit employment, Inuit training, Inuit ownership, such as subcontracting with Inuit firms that are on the IFR, and location in the Nunavut settlement area for Nunavut benefits. A key part of this directive is there is a lot more rigorous documenting and reporting of contracts in the NSA. So I'd mentioned that there's procurement plans up front, but for contracts in the NSA, there's a lot more detail around the data that's being collected. There's annual procurement information that's to be submitted to ISK, but there's also quarterly data that has to be submitted as well. The last thing I want to mention about this is that this is a first for a TBS directive, and this directive is there's an annual review committee which is co-chaired by TBS and the NTI, and it's to review the contracting data and essentially to determine the directive's effectiveness. And so I want to highlight that this is something that's very, very taken very seriously by us. It's and by the GOC. We want to make sure that we do it right. Okay, I think this is back to Daryl.
Next slide, please. So December 2020, ISK's deputy minister sent a request to his counterparts at core federal departments and agencies. ISK and PSPC ministers reiterated in January 2021 the importance of Indigenous procurement planning into a separate letter to counterparts, what Ian just referred to. So multi-year performance objectives from departments and agencies with a contracting budget in excess of $1 million are required by PSAP. So the letter went out and we started getting responses from the 71 departments that, with procurement budgets over $1 million. And so far, 31 of the 71 departments are committed to the 5% or more. So it's 44% of departments. So we could say that 49 of 71 departments with procurement budgets have submitted their plans so far. And things are looking positive. So we're also pleased to inform everyone that the PSAB report from 2015 to 2018 has been published. So that's big news for us, and that can be found online. If you want, just let me know. I can make sure you get the link for it. With respect to the Nunavut Directive, as required by Section 812, all departments with planned government contracts in the Nunavut settlement area are to provide annual plans, and Ian just touched on this as well. The directive requires that departments and agencies report to ISK within 6 months after the end of the fiscal year all contracts and leases that were entered into the Nunavut settlement area, and report whether they were limited for Inuit firms or if they contain bid criteria for Inuit benefits or Nunavut benefits. So, and Ian was mentioning the work they've done with NTI and the review committee. ISK played a role in the background, working with TBS under their leadership to make sure that the data that's been presented was validated. And we're looking forward to year 2. And yeah, so I'll leave it at that. Next slide, please. So the Government of Canada launched into a process to modernize procurement practices, as has been mentioned earlier in this presentation. So essentially that's why we're here. The three departments have been tasked with that, and with PSPC and TBS as well. So just quickly, I'll do the whys first. Why? I mean, to increase the number of federal procurement opportunities for Indigenous businesses, to increase the number of Indigenous small, medium enterprises, and their ability to bid on federal contracts, to support the growth of Indigenous business and its capacity, could create employment and training opportunities. Well, ISK has reached out to the online poll and online engagement, and over the last few years, well, since 2018 or 2018, with Indigenous businesses, Indigenous economic development organizations and their members, national and regional Indigenous organizations who make up a group, the Indigenous Reference Group, that's sort of leading this or help lead this. Modern treaty and land claims agreement holders, other levels of government, and corporate Canada. So I'll leave it right there for that slide. Next slide, please. So yeah, what we've heard basically from these extensive engagements is that since 2018, ISK has reviewed past analysis and evaluations to identify lessons learned, looked at successful procurement practices both in Canada and internationally to identify what makes them work. I've held these regional and national roundtables. I've had one-on-one engagements. I've engaged with Indigenous economic development organizations, like I've mentioned, and business and federal departments. And engagement's always ongoing. Developed recommendations for an improved approach to federal Indigenous participation in procurement, as outlined in discussion papers. So, and then online public engagement to validate the previous findings from a discussion paper from 2018. So That's where we are right now, and you'll see the rest of the presentation will sort of add to this as well. So I'll turn it over. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. My internet connection of all days is not ideal, and so I apologize if I freeze. So right, I'm Michelle from PSPC, and as previously mentioned, the 5% target for awarding contracts to Indigenous businesses was formalized in our minister's mandate letter of 2019. So the Minister of PSP was mandated to work with the Ministers of Indigenous Services and the President of the Treasury Board to create more opportunities for Indigenous businesses to bid on government contracts, and a target of 5% of the value of all federal contracts was set at 5% for Indigenous businesses. This is not new. As Daryl discussed earlier, there has been an aspirational 5% target for PSAB for 2 years now. So this commitment formalizes that target. We've been working very closely, the three departments, to come up with an approach, a government-wide approach, to ensure the achievement of the 5% target. It's a complex issue, needless to say. We talked about the importance of comprehensive land claims agreements and modern treaties and the existing procurement measures in those agreements, which we have as a government not really been very consistent in applying. So, the 5% target is certainly very important to implement, but we also have, just to reinforce Ian's point earlier, a real obligation to consider the existing modern treaty obligations as they relate to procurement and make every effort to meet those. I just wanted to make that point because we always talk about the 5%, and our experience with Nunavut shows us that those existing constitutionally protected rights in those modern treaties as relates to procurement are equally important. And each modern treaty is to be considered, and they're all equal in force. So even though Nunavut sued the government and got the directive in place, doesn't mean that it is more important than the other modern treaty obligations. What's tricky about those, though, is the way they're articulated in the agreements is not always clear in terms of how we should implement them. So again, my team gives advice on that and can help you respect those requirements in your procurements. So as it relates specifically to the 5%, though, Carolyn mentioned a memorandum to cabinet. So we have presented a memorandum to cabinet, and it did receive approval in principle by cabinet committee last week, and it's going to full cabinet for ratification hopefully next week. So we're limited in what we're able to discuss, like the details openly at this point. But just to share with you that the approval of that MC is imminent, and we'll be able to provide you with more information very soon. So if we can go to the next slide. So part of the recommended option in well, part of what we have to consider, I should say, in implementing the 5% certainly is data tracking and reporting. We have heard a lot from all departments that this is a major issue. And certainly we all know that data reporting in the government in general on procurement and otherwise is not ideal. The directive for Nunavut, though, did provide a very good example of what we should track and how we should track it. At this point, you know, to anticipate major systems adjustments, I don't know that that is necessarily feasible, but it's part of what we have to figure out in terms of implementing the 5%. And tracking it to show progress against the target. You have probably all heard about PSPC's electronic procurement solution. We worked very hard, all three departments, to include data elements in that solution to improve the tracking of procurements and specifically Indigenous procurement. So that may be an option for other departments in the future, depending on the rollout of the EPS to more broadly outside of PSPC. An interesting component about the 5% target and what we have heard from Indigenous partners is that there is a strong willingness by Indigenous partners to be involved in defining what is an Indigenous business and being involved in the management and perhaps even the ownership of the government's Indigenous business directory, and having the government move away from defining who and what businesses are Indigenous and having Indigenous peoples and businesses identify that for themselves. You probably have heard of Australia's Supply Nation model, which basically is a non-profit organization that is managed by Indigenous peoples of Australia in building awareness with government organizations of the Indigenous business capacity that exists. So we are looking at that model as an example and potentially applying that in Canada. So that it would encompass the current Indigenous business directory of the procurement strategy for Aboriginal business, but go far beyond that and build the directory to be bigger. So next slide, please. So we all know that trainings and tools are extremely important to support the contracting community in engaging with Indigenous businesses, in planning their procurements to increase their participation, to understand some of the cultural considerations when dealing with Indigenous businesses, to templates and checklists for clauses, and for solicitation documents, contracts. We understand the importance of that very much, and work is underway. We've actually we're getting close to finalizing one of the courses with the Canada School of Public Service, the C223 Indigenous Considerations in Procurement. We are also working to finalize a Nunavut directive specific course as well through the school. And then we'll be looking at cultural awareness training, engagement type of training, My team specifically is working on finalizing the clauses for the directive. We're also working on templates for and examples of setting up your bid evaluation criteria. And we're also developing tools for the Indigenous benefits plans, which you have probably heard of, which encourages prime contractors to provide plans as part of their bids to demonstrate how they will employ, train, or subcontract with Indigenous businesses and people. That is an extremely effective tool in addition to the approach of setting aside your procurement for Indigenous businesses, where capacity doesn't necessarily exist. There are this mechanism of generating benefits or increasing the participation of Indigenous people in government procurement has proven very effective and has received a very favorable response from Indigenous people. So as we move towards a solution for implementing the 5%, of course, engaging continually with the Indigenous business community to help them understand the federal procurement process, for us to understand the barriers they face when trying to participate in federal procurement. This aspect of barriers, whether it be financing or security clearances, that sort of thing, we know are difficult for Indigenous businesses and people. PSPC has been digging into that much more lately and working on, we pretty much know what the barriers are. And now we're looking at how we can actually either eliminate them or reduce them. That's a huge factor. So you can, build business directories and set targets. But at the end of it all, if a business can't jump through the hoops to actually bid on a contract, those they're not very helpful. So it's a complex issue. So we're taking a look at that, and we're constantly talking to the Indigenous business community, but we're also talking to Corporate Canada, as ISC is, to also prepare them and inform them on the measures that they can take to include Indigenous participation in their contracts or in the bids. Next slide, please. So that's it, I guess. I suspect you might have some questions on the 5%, but we're happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been really interesting. I must admit, I was blown away by the slide, Daryl, that you were talking about the potential increase in GDP of $27.7 billion. I mean, that's, if anything else, that says this is something we've got to do. We've got to take this seriously. So this is great. And I'm very excited to hear about those new courses. I think that will really help the community. So do you know whether those courses are going to be online or in person? Do you have any sense of that at this point?
They will be online, Carolyn. Online.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just makes it so much more accessible for other people, so for everyone. So that's great. Okay, wonderful. We do have a couple of questions already. Let me just go to the questions. So we have the first one. I think you answered, but let's just make sure we have the right answer. So is PSPC any closer to finalizing the standard template clauses in support of the Nunavut directive, and do we have a timeline? And I would also add to that, are those clauses going to be things that will be available to all departments, or will they just be for PSPC contracts?
So we're getting very close to finalizing those. I know it's taken much longer than we'd all hoped. And they will be available through our SAC manual, Standard Acquisitions, Conditions and Clauses manual, and therefore be available online and available to all government departments. I guess the reason why, if I can sort of explain why it's taken so long, you know, we're trying to go beyond, a little beyond writing clauses, but so the clauses will be there, but we also want to provide templates and some examples and sort of like an a la carte menu. So depending on your specific procurement and the requirements of your procurement, that there are sort of some, you know, ready-made a la carte sort of clauses and tools that you can pick and choose to meet the requirements of your procurement. So the goal is to provide more than clauses, like some real useful tools for contracting officers.
That's great. Next one, we've got quite a few questions, so this is great to see all these. So the next one was, has PSPC and ISC seen any examples where the holdbacks on IBC and NBC need to be utilized? Has there been any instance of the use of incentives?
Well, so that's another one. That's a tricky one. So we're still working that out with our legal services, to be very transparent. So the idea of holdbacks, you know, was a requirement presented by NTI. You know, it is a mechanism, an enforcement mechanism. I think what we all want is to avoid being in a situation where we even have to apply it. And so our guidance will be around that precisely. So how to manage through the contract management process the meeting of the benefits plan as presented as part of the bid, and managing it throughout the contract, having an open conversation and requiring reporting and updates on that, so that you're not in a situation at the end of the contract to say, well, you didn't do that and we're going to hold back payment. So yeah, we're working on that, and all that to say that no, we have not seen it applied in a procurement in Nunavut so far. The holdback clause, we've not seen a situation where it's had to be used.
Okay, thank you. A couple of quick, simple ones. Somebody was asking a question about set-asides and limited. Let me just go back to that. We've got quite a few questions. So this is a quick answer. The question was, well, here's a quick one. Do the trade agreements recognize Aboriginal benefit plans?
Do the modern treaties recognize?
I think it was actually the trade agreements, and I think is the
trade
answer
agreements.
that
Yes,
yes,
they do. So the trade agreements allow definitely for Indigenous benefits of any kind. So the set aside is one of them, but there are no limitations as to how we benefit Indigenous peoples through procurement, through federal procurement. So now we defer to the WTO in many instances because we're not on the government procurement chapter of the CUSMA. So there are no impediments whatsoever. We will never be challenged for putting in mechanisms in our contracting processes to benefit Indigenous people.
Perfect. This is a good one. Some of our clients seem to be resisting the spirit of modern treaties. And I think we've all seen sometimes that happen, right? For
Mhm.
example, if we would be contracting for a map of Nunavut, the technical authority could respond that all the contractor's work would be performed at the contractor's facility outside of Nunavut, so they could claim that the NSA wouldn't apply. How can we have more traction to convince technical authorities, our internal clients, where modern treaties seem to apply, but due to a technical loophole, these clients are resisting it? That's a really good question.
It is a good question. And the answer to that is there is no circumventing it. The contractual delivery point is not the primary consideration in this situation. You can have a break shipment, you can have something going to Montreal and warehoused, but you know eventually it'll be shipped in Nunavut. It is the final delivery point, the intended use of the good or where the ultimate service will be rendered is the determining factor. So it is a switch in mindset, and we know that it can be used as an avoidance mechanism, but we see it all the time. We advise on contracts all the time, and it's in our guide on government contracts in the NSA. That's clearly stipulated in there. It's clearly stipulated in the directive. And in fact, it doesn't really only apply to Nunavut. It's all modern treaties that we should be looking at them in that spirit always.
And in fact, that comes back to, you were talking about the courses that are going to be available through the Canada School of Public Service. When people take those courses, then procurement officers can, in their normal function, we often act as advisory educators to our technical authorities, our project authorities. So that can be something that we can do. Could you, I saw there was a comment in the chat, I believe, about, could you just rename the courses, because people already want to keep an eye out for them. So I know they're not there yet, but can you just give us the titles again?
Sure, I can actually write it in the chat. It's the C223 course that's offered at the school, and it's Indigenous considerations in procurement. So that is, it's not limited to Nunavut. It talks about CLCs in general and what can be done in PSAB and what can be done outside of both. So
too bad we couldn't mandate all of our clients take it. Yeah. Okay, so here's one from Lydia. Do you foresee any legal issues with the new joint ventures being formed to have certain companies qualify under the IFR?
Do you gentlemen want to respond to that? I think the general consensus is that there are not going to be any more risks than there currently are. But I don't know, Ian or Daryl, if you want to say anything.
So I'll just add that under the IFR, it would be the NTI who would make that determination on the legality of the joint venture. If it's determined that it is a firm that's legally capable of doing business in the NSA, then we accept that business as a qualified Inuit firm.
Fantastic, thank you. See another one. How, from J. Cesar or Kazar, how does this fit into any value propositions or industrial technology benefits when those are being used?
Mm-hmm. Ian? No?
Nope, why don't you take this one?
I don't think they mesh. I don't think they mesh. The ITB, the approach versus like.
I think the only time it maybe would have is recently the Canadian shipyard strategy. There was a definite, one of the two yards actually did an arrangement, I believe, with the Nunavut College, and it was tied to training of people, because they're constantly actually starved for in the shipbuilding strategy, starved for qualified technical people. And so that was, I think, perhaps not an official linking of the two, but certainly an unofficial where people are saying, I have a need, this serves my need, it serves more than one need. And so that would be maybe one good example that we could see. The industrial technical benefits are usually brought about in very large
It's a really good
projects.
question. I wouldn't mind like taking that with me and giving it a think and then responding back to the person who had posed the question. It's a really good question.
Thank you. That'd be wonderful. Okay, I'm just going through our list. Yes. Has PSPC ISC reassessed with the NTI vendor community the burden of IBC and NBC pose on the vendor community? It seems like a big departure from the idea of simplifying our solicitations to build capacity to all of a sudden having these lengthy and involved RFP requirements.
Sort of, I'm going to take this one back with me as well, but I mean, it's something that I know that we've been talking to some departments about. There's especially at defense, it seems, but let me get back to whoever, I don't know how you want to do this, but let me look into this one, if you don't mind.
Well, what you can do is any of these questions that you actually are going to be getting back to us on, we will be posting this deck and this recording in probably about a week's time on our member site. And so we could actually pose the questions and answers there so that way we would be able to have everybody have access to that information.
But there's no doubt that in general, this does represent additional work that didn't exist anymore before. And I think it's just, you know, something that we're all going to have to get used to and will just over time become natural, normal. But there's no doubt that it's a little labor intensive for sure.
Yeah, but I think that as a procurement person who's been around for 38 years in this business, I can say there's always something new, and we're really pretty good at just figuring out and making it work. Because again, what we're about is bringing value, and you know, and I think that that's something procurement has. I've seen all sorts of changes over the years, and I think that this is a long time coming and a necessary one. I mean, let's go back to Daryl's bullet about $27.7 billion more in GDP.
Yep.
So I mean, let's
right,
get serious, guys.
Yeah, and we've seen it. You know, some folks that we deal with know the directive like the back of their hand and make every effort, and it works and it's great. So I think it's just a matter of learning it, and then once you know it, you're able to apply it. Yeah.
And maybe for our final question from Benoit Gelpo, if a vendor is not listed in the Indigenous Business Directory, can it still be considered for a PSAB or incidental Aboriginal contract?
Sorry, can you repeat that again?
Yes. If a vendor is not listed in the Indigenous Business Directory, can it still be considered for a PSAB or incidental Aboriginal contract?
I could, the first part, no, I think it has to be in the IBD. The second part, I have to check into.
Okay, perfect. And I think I'm just scrolling through all the questions. I think we've got through them. I'm just still scrolling. And let me just check and see if there's anything in the chat. I think we've done all those. Yes, this is a final one. Did I miss something from someone it's anonymous? But I understood that the training covered procurement for Inuit businesses. What about other Indigenous groups? And I think the question was that it was not specific to Inuit, but I think that was your answer, but perhaps we can have clarification on that. So that comes back again to the training. And I think that it's a broad focused training, really covering all of those. I think you mentioned all of the current CLCAs.
Yeah, there will be both. So
Okay.
the Indigenous, yeah, there will be both.
Yeah.
I think the question also might be related to what you had mentioned around the Nunavut Directive specific training. So that's going to be specific to Nunavut Directive, but the C223 covers kind of the procurement strategy for Aboriginal business as well as CLCA areas.
So I think that's it for the questions, and those were really great questions. So to all of the delegates out there and attendees, thank you. It's always great to see an active participation. And for our panelists, Michelle, Ian, and Daryl, thank you again so much. This has been great. I can tell you that this is going to be one of these presentations that people are going to be sharing with their colleagues who may or may not have been able to be here today. We had quite a large group today, so this is great. Thank you again. As far as it goes, stay tuned. We'll have the recording and the deck up in the next week or two, and hope to see you all again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.